He's trespassing. Arrest him now. I don't care if he claims to own this ranch. The HOA Karen shrieked at the cops she'd called on me while I stood on my own property. I'd just driven 12 hours to visit my family ranch, only to be greeted by police lights, and this blonde woman demanding my arrest. She stood there smirking, confident she'd won. What this small-town HOA president didn't know was that back in Washington, my office wall displays photos of 300 HOA presidents I've personally sent to federal prison. My actual job. I run the department that can shut down any HOA in America with one phone call. If you're watching from your own HOA nightmare, comment your location, because this woman just made the biggest mistake of her life. My name is Nathan Hayes, and after 15 years of fighting homeowner association tyranny from behind a desk in Washington, I'd finally decided to take a break. My grandfather's ranch in Texas had been calling to me, promising peace, quiet, and maybe some decent fishing. What I got instead was a masterclass in small-town corruption that would make a mob boss blush. The woman currently directing officers to arrest me for criminal trespassing had apparently been waiting 20 years for this moment. And over the next 72 hours, she would discover exactly why messing with the head of national HOA oversight was the biggest mistake of her life. Hour 1 of what I now call the Willow Brook. War began when I pulled into the ranch's gravel driveway at 9 p.m., exhausted. My truck's headlights swept across the wooden fence my grandfather had built, and for a moment, the tension eased. After months of a brutal HOA case in Portland, I needed rest. The patrol car's siren shattered the quiet before I could grab my duffel. 2 officers approached with cautious intensity. I kept my hands visible and offered to show my deed. That's when Margaret Williams power walked across the lawn in what she clearly considered official HOA attire. Business pants, a visor, and venom. Margaret claimed the land was HOA-controlled common area and demanded action. Officer Rodriguez examined my deed and reluctantly acknowledged my ownership. Margaret, however, hinted at boundary discrepancies and suggested this was a civil matter. As patrol cars left, she stepped closer and hissed personal venom. Her family, she said, had been ruined by my father 20 years earlier. She warned me I had 72 hours to consider selling, the heels clicking like a countdown. She left me with the sense that this was personal, generational, and far uglier than property disagreements. Day 2 was an onslaught. At 7 a.m., I found my porch plastered with 47 violation notices. Everything from grass height to mailbox color to a ludicrous charge for a visible coffee mug. Each one was signed and time-stamped by Margaret. One note, handwritten and blunt, told me I had 70 hours to sell or face consequences. The postscript named Judge Harrison. I knew Harrison from my files. Squeaky clean enough to evade federal probes, but tied to suspicious HOA-friendly rulings. The scale of the attack suggested more than a petty president. This smelled of organized theft. Neighbors started to show up with evidence. Linda Thompson handed me a folder of Margaret's patterns, hundreds of targeted violations, ruined lives, and a spreadsheet of fines that appeared deliberately engineered to push owners out. Tom Bradley had lost his house over a bird feeder. Pets disappeared. Gardens died. Cars were vandalized. The pattern was methodical. Margaret targeted dissenters and wore them down with fines, legal bills, and fear. The harassment escalated into intimidation. Anonymous texts warned me about accidents and cemetery plots. Margaret's threats implied judicial complicity. I installed a security camera after her early threats, a professional habit, and discovered its payoff when footage captured Robert Williams spraying herbicide through my grandmother's rose garden at 3:17 a.m. The audio even carried Margaret's voice, directing specifics. The roses were history, and the attack was surgical. Only the heritage plants were dead. The grief was sharp. Those roses had crossed generations. Local law enforcement moved slowly. Deputy Chin offered condolences, but warned of limited options without airtight proof. I had proof. The footage, conversations, and prior trespass incidents established a pattern. Margaret's team had been measuring fence posts at odd hours, photographing my property, and bringing in a suited man to inspect boundary markers. Worse, a recorded conversation revealed Margaret and Judge Harrison discussing creative legal paperwork to condemn property on health and safety grounds and force a sale if I didn't yield. This was conspiracy. I called in help quietly. Elena Martinez, a lawyer ally, agreed to review everything. I also alerted my boss in Washington, requesting files on Judge Harrison and contact info for the FBI Public Corruption Unit. My vacation had turned into an off-the-books investigation. Still, I couldn't take the obvious route. Local policing and long civil litigation would only give Margaret and Harrison time to cover tracks. I needed to use their methods against them. Neighbors like Dorothy Kim provided context. Margaret drove down property values. Harrison's shell companies bought cheap parcels. And together they flipped land for resort development. My grandfather's ranch sat on a spring-fed 60 acres with highway access. Exactly the prize they coveted. Dorothy would testify, but warned a single witness wouldn't suffice against a judge and entrenched local power. So I compiled the security footage, the audio confession, the violation history, and neighbor affidavits. I kept copies in multiple secure locations and planned carefully. Margaret had exposed herself, threats that referenced my father's death, a judicial ally on stage, and a pattern of manufactured violations. In HOA warfare, that's called showing your hand. She'd made a fatal mistake. Hour 48 was a grim morning. The roses were ruined. The sheriff documented the vandalism. I played back surveillance that showed clear conspiratorial acts. The evidence was enough to escalate, but it needed the right path. The following hours were a dance of careful pressure, public exposure, federal referrals, quiet legal maneuvers, and leveraging my institutional knowledge about how HOA corruption operates. At hour 60, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting to cement the narrative against me. The community center was packed. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, a signal that this was more than local drama. I entered quietly through the back to observe. Margaret plastered the screen with photoshopped images of my property and spun a tale of environmental and safety hazards. A classic pretext. The room hummed with nervous energy as she painted me as a dangerous outsider. And her board readied paperwork to condemn the land. Our architectural committee has documented over 200 violations in just 3 months. Each one deliberate, strategic, and designed to break the will of anyone who dared resist. Margaret paced across the stage of Willowbrook's Community Center, her voice sharp as glass. Behind her, a projection screen flicked through photos of supposed violations. Trash cans slightly out of line, fences an inch too tall, lawns with a single brown patch. The audience shifted uncomfortably, caught between fear and disbelief. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, arms folded, a silent reminder of the power behind her words. I stayed in the back, hood pulled low, listening. Margaret's presentation was more theater than evidence. She gestured dramatically, painting me as an intruder, a troublemaker, a dangerous man who threatened the order of Willowbrook. On cue, her board members handed out glossy packets filled with doctored images and fabricated citations. Her plan was obvious: bury the truth beneath an avalanche of paper. She called for a vote of condemnation, claiming the ranch was hazardous and unfit for habitation. If approved, Judge Harrison would sign the order, and my family's land would be seized within days. The crowd murmured uneasily. Some nodded along, too beaten down by years of her control to resist. Others whispered doubts. I stepped forward before the vote could be called. The room fell silent as I placed a small projector on the table. "If you're going to show evidence," I said, "let's make sure it's the whole picture." My thumb pressed play. The screen flickered. Suddenly, the room was watching Robert Williams, Margaret's own husband, caught on night vision camera, spraying poison into my grandmother's rose garden. Her voice could be heard clearly, giving instructions. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I followed with audio recordings of Margaret and Judge Harrison discussing fabricated condemnations and land seizures. Every word was clear, undeniable. Faces in the crowd shifted from confusion to outrage. Margaret sputtered, trying to reclaim the stage, but the momentum was gone. "Enough," I said. "This isn't about violations or community standards. This is about power, greed, and corruption. And it ends tonight." The board tried to adjourn, but neighbors demanded answers. Years of fear cracked, replaced by anger. Linda Thompson stood and waved her folder of evidence. Tom Bradley followed, recounting how he'd lost his home to bogus fines. Dorothy Kim, voice trembling but steady, revealed the pattern of land flipping tied to Harrison's shell companies. Piece by piece, Margaret's empire crumbled under the weight of truth. The sheriff, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stepped forward. "Mrs. Williams, Judge Harrison, we're going to need to talk." His deputies moved in, collecting statements, securing the projector, and escorting both Margaret and Harrison out. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in something that felt like relief. For the first time in decades, Willowbrook had hope. The next 48 hours were a blur. FBI agents arrived, tipped off by the files I'd sent to Washington. Boxes of records were seized from Margaret's office. Harrison's rulings came under federal review. Neighbors lined up to testify, emboldened by the chance to finally be heard. Margaret's smirk was gone when the cuffs clicked around her wrists. Harrison tried to maintain composure, but the cameras caught the sweat on his brow as agents led him into an unmarked car. Their fall was swift, decisive, irreversible. Cleanup took longer. Undoing years of damage meant combing through hundreds of fraudulent fines. Restoring titles and rebuilding trust. I stayed to help, guiding neighbors through the process, ensuring their voices carried weight. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Linda brought me a small box. Inside was a cutting from my grandmother's roses. She'd nurtured it back to life from what Robert had tried to kill. "Figured you'd want this replanted?" she said softly. My throat tightened. Some battles take more than paperwork to win. Some require roots, history, and resilience. When the last of the federal paperwork was filed, I prepared to leave. Willowbrook no longer needed me. It had found its own strength. The neighbors who once whispered in fear now stood tall, united. They had reclaimed their community, and in doing so, reclaimed themselves. As I packed my truck, Dorothy approached. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" I smiled. "Now you live free, and if anyone tries to take that from you again, you know how to fight." The road stretched out before me, the ranch fading in the rearview mirror. I hadn't planned on a war when I came here, but sometimes wars find you. And when they do, you fight not just for land, but for people, for memory, for justice. The Willowbrook War wasn't won with fists or firepower, but with truth, courage, and the refusal to be silenced. And as Margaret and Harrison faced the reckoning they'd long evaded, I knew one thing for certain: this was a victory worth remembering. Poetic justice worth savoring. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more unbelievable HOA battles.